Well, we've had several workshops so far. Small plug for next week if you are in New Orleans, and it will also be Sunday. 2 to 5, our very own, for those of you that are CWW affiliated, our very own Kirsten Renault is going to be leading a Flash CNF workshop at St. Roch. Yeah. And if you can't make next week's, the week after, it'll be online for you. So if you're interested in doing a Zoom workshop and not an in-person one. So yeah, we have a lot going on with Liminal between our workshops and our readings, and eventually we will have residencies as well. But this is our first reading, so thank you for being here, thank you for taking the plunge, and thank you to our dear readers, Natalka, Tay, and Olivia, for joining us. So without further ado, we will go ahead and introduce our first reader. Natalka Proszak.
So, I already actually adore Natalka, really attentive and probing personality, our somehow mesmerizing dialogues after Goldrum, the kind where there's that sort of suspension of time. And when I heard her writing, it's the same exact thing that happens. It's really quiet. Yeah, it's true. It's really quiet, even delicate, though image dense, threaded to kind of hold the emotional and historical and personal weight of her story, so to speak. It's like this architecture that spans vast expanses, oceans of space and time, from the Ukraine to Canada to New Orleans, where her mythic and mystic sensibilities made her seem immediately, at least to me, like one of our own, so to speak.
Natalka Proszak is a writer and visual artist from Montreal, Quebec. Her sculptural and installation works have been exhibited across Canada and the United States, and her writing has been published in Soliloquies Anthology and by Goldfish Press. Please welcome to the stage our very first reader, Natalka.
Love you, yeah.
Well, I'm going to read a short story, and it's from a collection called Joyland Beach. And really, the only thing that you need to know about Joyland Beach is that it's in the middle of nowhere, and it's populated almost exclusively by misfit adults and relatively feral children.
Yeah, that
Higher?
No.
The third time I tried to run away from home, I set a field on fire. The one behind the Joyland Beach Community Center, where kids from the neighborhood would go to have gasoline and throw rocks at beer bottles they'd stolen from their parents. They'd string up the bottles in rows against a piece of rotting plywood and throw the rocks hard, creating a savage rendition of the beanbag toss at a fall fair. The matchbook had been an afterthought, but when I opened the junk drawer in the kitchen, where my father kept piles of unopened bills, rubber bands, and loose change, I saw it there, the image of a golden bird standing on one foot against a burgundy background. They were from the Sandpiper, a bar on the 3rd Concession Road, where my father spent most of his free time. Leaving the house, I'd crept past him, his head in his arms slumped over the kitchen table. The shape of his body this way is so familiar to me. In the field, the autumn air was damp, cool against my cheeks. The sky above me held the stars in place. I struck the matches, one by one, then two by two, let them burn down until my fingertips stung, tossed them into a pile of dead leaves at my feet. Each time the leaves lit up with a luminous hiss, I saw the urgency I felt inside take shape. I don't know if I'd intended for the fire to spread, but fire moves fast, faster than a 12-year-old girl who doesn't know where she's going. I watched the flames crawl out into the field, a hot geometry cast off, moving with a sense of direction I wanted so badly to have. I looked around for something to quell the burn, and all I saw were the remnants of broken bottles. But the ground was damp from a recent downpour of rain, and the fire could only spread so far before it was snuffed by wet earth. As the flames died down, so did my desire to run. Sometimes the idea of running away from something is more of a relief than the act of doing it. I returned home to find everything as I had left it. My father at the table in his brown velour housecoat, an empty bottle next to him, a plastic jar of peanuts tipped over on the table next to an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts, a few of which had rolled off the table and landed on the floor next to a newspaper announcing the tragic death of Princess Diana to the world. His favorite radio show, Big Band Sunday Night, moaned out at a low volume from the radio in the kitchen, and the remaining embers of a log burned out in the wood stove. I stared at my father, feeling like he was something that had been returned to me by mistake. I hated him in this moment, more than I hated myself for coming home. My father shuffled. It wasn't my arrival that woke him up, but the sound of a trumpet coming from the radio speakers. He rubbed his eyes, lit a cigarette, and looked at me. "Edie," he said, "you like this song?" It was difficult to know which version of him I'd encounter in moments like this, and who I'd have to be in response. I tried to read the tension in his face as he squinted, the subtle tremble of his hand as he brought the cigarette to his lips, shifted his weight in his chair, inhaled the smoke. "No," I said. "You will one day." "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true. One day you'll realize that they have the same feeling inside as you do." "Who are you talking about?" He spoke slowly. He said, "I'm talking about a feeling, about connection." "This music is awful," I said, and I looked for something in his eyes that would tell me he'd really heard me, that he understood we were nothing alike. But he only snapped his fingers and nodded his head along with the song, out of time. "You'll see," he said, looking right through me and off into some imaginary distance, to a place where the feeling inside of him was beautiful. "You're wrong," I said. "You want to bet, kid?" "How about $200? I said. "Ho-ho, we've got a gambler on our hands. You're on." He raised his arms and fluttered his fingers around like there was a piano suspended in the air above him, and he was trying to play it. He lost his balance, nearly fell from his chair. "We'd better shake on it," he said, steadying himself and reaching toward me. I don't know why I took his hand. I felt the weight of it in my own, felt his calloused fingertips against my palm. His veins bulged up through his hand, and I imagined the blood moving through them like a river. I thought of my own blood, coursing with the same force, the same speed, our blood branching a million ways from its origin, sharing a uniform current. "You smell like a campfire," he said. A piano solo took flight from the speakers. Listen to the piano," he said, and he sang along with the melody so that I might really hear him, so that I might really know what he was feeling. I pulled my hand away from his. "You know," he said, "we've got a piano coming here tomorrow, a Bechstein, German. I'd like you to take lessons. You've got a piano player's hands, you know." I dug my fingernails into my palms. Knowing he wouldn't remember in the morning, I was bold. I said, "I'll take piano lessons if you quit drinking." Well, he said, let me see if I can get my hands on a trumpet instead. He picked up a piece of lined paper from the table in front of him, covered in a list of things he'd never get through. He turned it over and began to write. A contract for the bet, he said. He scribbled something about the feeling of big band music, signed his name, and pushed the paper toward me. Good night, I said, walking away. On the bus returning home from school the next day, I sat with my head pressed against the glass window. The empty fields lining the road folded into one another as we passed them. I traced the steady swoop of the power lines on the window pane with my finger until we turned off the third concession road and they disappeared. The sides of the dead-end gravel road leading into Joyland Beach were littered with derelict houses, their unkempt yards covered in piles of scrap metal and broken machinery that looked as old as the willow trees surrounding them. The bus pulled over at the top of my laneway, dropped me off next to the weather vane my father had built from copper pipes and broken pieces of brass fire tools. Walking toward my house, I saw a rusty pickup parked in the driveway. My father and a man I didn't recognize, both red-faced, drenched in sweat, were pushing a piano across the driveway toward our house. I hid behind the truck bed and watched them struggle like two drunken pallbearers trying to move a coffin. Come on, push, Yannick, my father yelled. Get your knees into it. I'm pushing. This fucking wheel's caught on something. The man's polyester paisley shirt clung to his back with sweat. He bent his knees and, releasing a guttural howl, heaved the piano toward my father, who stumbled against the force and fell to the ground. Opa! My father yelled, laughing until his shoulders shook. Jesus, Mick, you all right? The man said. He wiped his hands on his denim shorts, leaving a smear of sweat and dirt across the thigh. Of course I'm all right. I'm the bloody piano man. Maybe a good time for a break. He got up from the ground and walked over to a red plastic cooler sitting next to his truck. Edie, he said when he saw me, what are you doing down there? Get over here and take a look at this grand beauty. And meet Yannick. He's going to be living with us for a while. He's Greek. Yannick was a burly man with warm, dark eyes and a thick mustache that hung over his mouth and down the sides of his chin like a rodent's tail. Is that your piano? I asked him. It was, but it's yours now, he said. He grinned at me like he had done a very fine thing. Handing Yannick a beer from the cooler, my father said, Show Yannick your hands, Edie. Go on, don't be shy. I'm not shy, I said. Great piano hands, Yannick said. Your ivory awaits you, miss. He turned and bowed at the piano, sitting unevenly on the gravel, its broken wheel next to it. Edie, why don't you go inside and get some blankets? Bring them out to the trailer in the backyard for Yannick. Make it comfortable for him. We'll get this old Fraulein in the house one way or another. Then Yannick wants to make us some supper. He's a great cook. I cook at the Sandpiper, Yannick said. You like kebab? The piano was too big for our house, but my father made do by wedging it up against the wall outside the bathroom. On its top, he propped a sun-bleached map of the world, encased in a gaudy gold frame he'd purchased at a thrift store in town. He put down a couple of woven placemats on the top of the piano and a glass elephant whose tusks had been broken off. The dark wood panel was covered in pale watermarks, rings from the carelessly placed drinks of strangers. The keys, many of which were chipped and stained, looked like a row of long neglected teeth. A black cigarette burn was melted into one near the middle. My father leaned a tattered yellow book on the bow-shaped music stand, which was, surprisingly, still intact. Well, he said, making a final, minute adjustment to the elephant's position. Ready to have a go? It's gross, I said, sneering at the piano. But I did want to learn. I did want to play, and I only refused because of how much it seemed to mean to him, how much it would please him to see me do it. I waited until he doddered into the bathroom for a shower, and I approached the piano. I opened the frail, pulpy pages of the lesson book. Through the window, I could see Yannick in the backyard. He was perched, motionless, in a lawn chair in front of the Monarch trailer, where he'd taken up residence, sunning the underside of his chin with a foil sunshade meant for a car windshield. His eyes were closed, and he wore a satisfied smile. He adjusted himself slightly. A blast of sunshine bounced off the shade right into my eyes. It wouldn't be long before he came in to cook dinner for us, which he insisted on doing each night. I heard the tap squeak as my father turned it, followed by the shudder of pipes, the rush of water. I played a scale, pressing the keys gently, not wanting to be heard over the sound of the shower. I played the scale several times, trying to commit it to memory, and as I moved through it, my fingers gliding over the stained keys, I felt the resonance of each note with my whole body. I closed my eyes, tried to follow the sounds as they disappeared, my body moving with them, drifting apart into smaller and smaller pieces, off into some unimaginable distance. When I opened my eyes, I felt a strange pride at the look of my hands, at fingers that did, after all, seem made for this action. The tap squeaked again, the water stopped, and I stopped in the middle of a scale. I snapped the lesson book shut and hurried to my room, careful to avoid the floorboards I knew would creak under my steps. "Look," said Yannick, hovering over the table to display the platter of food. "I made the meat look like a bunny." A gray slab of meat hulked on the platter, formed roughly into the shape of a bloated rabbit's head. One ear stuck straight up, while the other was bent at a sharp angle. Surrounding the rabbit were about a dozen slices of cucumber that Yannick had carefully carved into the shape of rose blossoms. He grinned and, slanting the platter toward me, pumped it up and down a few times. "Hop, hop, hop," he said. Grease dripped onto the table. "Here comes Peter Cottontail," said my father. He was struggling to prop himself up on the table, his face smooshed against one hand, his other hand holding a cigarette that had gone out. "Peter Cottontail," he repeated, laughing. With a knife, Yannick separated 3 hunks of meat from the loaf. He lifted and lowered them carefully onto 3 mismatched plates. With his finger, he pushed a few cucumbers off the platter and onto each plate. My father stared at his food, smiled, and then relit his cigarette. As Yannick and I ate and my father drank, Yannick spoke of his childhood in Greece. When he landed, by way of a long, meandering monologue, on the subject of Greek music, my father broke his silence. "Are you playing the piano, Edie?" Without lifting my eyes from my plate, I said, "No." "No? This piano came all the way from Germany for you, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean." "It's broken," I said, heat rising into my cheeks. "Broken," he scoffed. He picked up a knife and fork and, holding them lazily, said, "What, it's not good enough for you to learn on?" He slapped the table with an open hand. "Who do you think you are?" He repeated the question and looked down. Following his eyes, I saw the dark line of blood widening across the back of his hand. "Christ," he said, "I've cut my hand." He stood. "I'm bleeding," he said, and left the room. "There's a Band-Aid around here somewhere," Yannick called after him, his mouth full of meat. He looked at me. "Just a little cut. Nothing to worry about. Your father is a tough man. You come from tough people, Trebillion people. Nothing to worry about." From the driveway came the sound of the Grand Marquis starting, followed by the sound of its attached trailer rustling and clanging as my father pulled off. Yannick went to the open door, looked out into the night. "He'll be fine," he said. "The Sandpiper is only 6 miles away. A straight shot. He'll be back. He'll come home." Yannick looked at me. "Should we put on some radio music?" That night I dreamed of a burning field. I understood that it was the same fire I'd set. I knew the sound of it, the way it hissed and crawled. I knew it would consume the distant trees, the old barns and brittle shacks and creaking houses, all of Joyland Beach, and I watched it glowing brilliantly before my eyes. In the morning, Yannick woke me up. "Your school bus came and went," he said. "Come on, I'll drive." In his truck, heading toward school, Yannick said, "Your dad? Doing fine. They called, the bar. He slept there." Yannick laughed. "What about his hand?" "A few stitches, that's all. Bartender Jerry took care of it. Good as new in no time. What did I tell you? Trillion." "I don't know what that means," I said. "You don't know where you come from?" "Edie," he said, stretching the syllables of my name. "Me, I am Greek. I come from philosophers, astronomers, lovers." Beneath his seatbelt, he moved his belly around in something of a figure eight. "And we gave drama to the world. You, your father, Trillion." The truck's windows framed a dense gray sky outside. The clouds hovered low over the familiar landscape of neglect and disarray in which I saw nothing of beauty. As we curved along the bends in the road approaching the school, Yannick slowed down, flicked on the turn signal with the palm of his hand. "Wait," I said. "Wait, why? You forgot something? A book?" "Could we go get him?" I said, "from the Sandpiper?" Yannick stopped the car in the middle of the empty road, looked toward the school, then back at me. He nodded his head, smiling. "It's a good idea," he said. As we picked up speed, Yannick continued. "Trillion people were very strong, resilient, invented agriculture, farmers. And, you see, they burned their own houses down, whole settlements. You know why?" I shook my head. "Me neither," said Yannick. "Not for me to know." He turned on the radio. "That sounds nice," he said. We continued along the road without speaking. Yannick slowed his truck, pulled into the Sandpiper's parking lot, where the rusted Grand Marquis was parked on the corner, trailer in tow. The car's windows were rolled down, and my father was asleep in the driver's seat, his head in his arms, leaning against the steering wheel. "Let me wake him up," I said. I wondered what he must dream about. I wondered if he was dreaming of the same burning field.
Give it up one more time for Natalka. It's not easy going first.
Next up we have Tavy Smith. Tavy Smith, yeah. Tay is a really great example of how fiction and poetry can portray reality more accurately than nonfiction writers do. And his performance is a whole other element that makes Tay stand apart. Last time, for example, he sat down and pulled this bag of Flamin' Hot Cheetos out of his backpack, and I literally thought that I was in my classroom. Seriously. Maybe I have a soft spot for his work as a teacher myself, but from the way that everyone erupts in simultaneous laughter, or at other times goes like totally silent from holding their breath, I'm pretty sure that this work is universal. Loss, miscommunication, grief, indignation, and yes, a lot of love. Get ready for all the feels, all the emotions packaged with care, and a little bit of humor. Tavy Smith.
Tavy Smith wrote some books. One, a middle grade novel in verse, Exit Ticket, is being published by Hidden Timber Books with an early 2023 release date. Stay tuned. Some of his short fiction was and will be published in fancy places. Tay lives, teaches, and drinks an absurd amount of kombucha in New Orleans, Louisiana. Give it up for Tay.
Turn to your neighbor, say neighbor.
Neighbor.
Turn to your neighbor, say neighbor. Neighbor. That boy up there.
That boy
Point,
there.
point, up here. That boy up there. That boy right there.
That boy right there.
Is unholy.
Unholy. Right?
Amen, saints. Mama, the preacher, and the usher say I'm unholy. A word. The worst word you can hear in church. A word used to describe anything God can't clean. My unholiness is bottled up like a sharp gift cut open or a faucet trickling tainted desire. A word used to explain hauntings that God gives humankind. Then, with the fear of the Holy Ghost, threatens eternal punishment for those lovely longings. I'll tell you how it feels to be lost in longings. To be a broken boy. How it feels when God splits a child in half. Charles, why are you like this? Mama asks. Her open hands welded into the top of her waist. I swallow and sigh hard. I ain't the easiest kid to raise. I want to be easy, or better, or more like the kids who never get their Sunday clip-ons crinkled or their handcuffs dirty, like the kids who don't misspell righteousness on their preliminary tests. Righteousness. A word synonymous with implausible. It is implausible to believe that my name doesn't mean bitter, like dirt in the back of Mama's throat. I'm Chuck. Mama only calls me Charles when Chuck has done something that makes her remind me to be more Charles than Chuck, like not to throw things carelessly like my words or my actions. Mama's friends say I just can't get right. The word right, the way they spray it at me, is used to paint all the pictures of all the things that are supposed to make me holy and acceptable, like pretending the Sunday school lessons about talking bushes ain't sex magic, or that the church mother who calls the assistant pastor an old funky motherfucker under her breath is an example of heaven. I don't know what I'm like. I don't know what I am, so I don't know how to respond to Mama. Why every time I take my eyes off you, you do something foolish, she asks. Why are you such a heavy thing on my heart? Mama paces. I can tell this conversation will end with her asking me questions, me giving answers that don't add up, that will equal to her beating my damned ass. Like, it's never just ass. Always my damned ass. Me, my ass, and damnation all linked together. Seems like Mama has only got two ways of being these days. She's either mad at me, which means storming around the house in silence, raining down just enough care to avoid neglect, or asking Jesus for mercy for being so angry over bills, her job, or me. It's just me and Mama. I ain't never met my daddy in person. Only seen a picture of the two of them holding hands in front of an old Buick. Older versions of my face divided. Daddy looked to be 2 feet taller than Mama. Cocoa, dark, and dressed as clean as the devil himself. That I'm sure God ain't never been as cool as my parents in Focus. I always imagined the Lord in overalls, fat from all the blessings he's withheld, standing on the corner of East St. Louis and Charlie Park, screaming lame condemnations. My daddy stands more on top of the photo than as a part of it, leaning between Mama and the driver's door. His shoulders stretched wide enough to set the horizon. Daddy, draped in a black leather jacket with fur around the collars, wearing dark jeans and a pair of black and white Chuck Taylors, with Mama nestled under his arm. She don't look worried. She don't look stressed. She's smiling from ear to ear, evidence that she was happy once. A folded black and white Polaroid. with white lightning strikes running down the corners. Tucked behind Mama's old spelling bee trophy is all I have left to remind me of what family could be. But Mama is the oldest of 5 children. Auntie Nessa, the youngest of Mama's siblings, came knocking 3 times last summer. The first time she was running from her boyfriend and needed a place to stay for a day that turned into a week. Auntie Nessa only referred to him as broke-ass nigga on account of them getting evicted from an apartment Mama said they couldn't afford anyway. The second time, her and this my baby, formerly known as broke-ass nigga, came over to visit on the 4th of July for 5 days. They ate all the ribs, all the potato salad, all the hamburgers, even ate all the hot dogs when everybody know the hot dogs are for the kids on the last visit. Auntie Nessa came alone. I was in the kitchen at the table reading when she pushed back the door and exploded into the house. Give me a fucking hug, Chuck. I jumped up and tackled her by the waist. I stayed there, pretending to wiggle away from her kisses until Mama walked in. Auntie Nessa smelled like sweet and fun perfume and cigarettes, and even let me sip some Crown Royal ones when Mama asked her to babysit. Nessa sat down at the table, and after about 5 minutes of talking, Mama asked Mama for money for her and her broke nigga sweetheart. Mama said no. Auntie Nessa, who either didn't see or didn't care about the pain growing on Mama's face, started to throw out names of cities and countries and inviting her to guess where my daddy might be. Chicago, Auntie Nessa said, in a way that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Nessa, Mama responded, trying to act unbothered. Tokyo, Auntie Nessa said mid-check. Oh shit, hell, nigga might be in Narnia. God damn it, Nessa. Mama finally yelled and excused herself upstairs. She returned about 5 minutes later with a relaxed face and handed her sister a small roll of money. Auntie Nessa thanked Mama with a half smile, flashed on me a whole one, and left. Without saying a word, Mama went back upstairs, slammed her door shut, and played gospel music loud enough for Jesus to hear. My first ass beating of the summer happened on a Sunday. I felt good that morning. Good enough to dance from the kitchen into the living room. My bowl of soggy cornflakes overfloweth. I circled Mama's golden lion, wrist and body, twirling through the air with more flair and hip than what is deemed suitable for boys. The Lion of Judah was Mama's representation of the Lord's protection. The day she bought the gold paint, Mama soaked the porcelain statue and placed it on stretches of newspaper as the sun dried and perfected each coat of her offering. The Mississippi Mass Choir belted from our speakers as Mama sang loudly. I wish I could have existed in those melodies forever. Mama slid back and forth as if she was waltzing with Christ himself. I smiled, large enough to breathe, large enough to know that at that moment Mama was too. I joined her in praise. Been running for Jesus a long time, she said. With jubilant response, I shouted back, and I'm not tired yet. 3 months after the best day we'd ever had, in the middle of a graceful pirouette, my knee slipped. The ear of Judah went sliding across the living room floor, and Mama running, not tired yet, with her belt in hand. My second ass beating happened after our neighbor, Mrs. Ukwu, who moved to East St. Louis from Nigeria, caught me jumping double dutch with her daughters in the backyard. Mrs. Ukwu stood on the porch, sucked her teeth, shook her head, and waited. She called for Mama when she got home from work that night. I pressed my ear against the thin wall. Mrs. Ukwu's concern sounded like a direct insult against Mama's parenting, which meant that I was a direct insult against her parenting. I stayed in the house for the next 3 days until the whelps from the thick belt Mama nicknamed Miles Davis, on account of her beating me black and blue, had subsided. I'm sure our third ass beating will happen today. We were forced to leave church early because of something I showed in public. In a space too sacred for self-worship, Mama is still cooking up or calming her anger, and I'm still sitting on the couch with a belly full of rocks, simmering on her question, why am I like this? An answer, I should probably tell you why we had to leave church early today. I finally hugged Alex. It happened after we'd circled the sanctuary, after the women closed their eyes tight and dropped their best into the collection plate, and after the men growled as they let go of the minimum required cover charge for a portion of God's love, I purposely, accidentally, maybe, ran into Alex near the last row. He came in for a shug, a half hug, half handshake, where two hands gripping a fist sandwiched between two men or boys, while the other hand reaches around the back for a tap, hug on the shoulder. It's important to know that there's a 2-tap limit on a shug before it gets weird. I reach around Alex, 3 taps, then slide my hand out of his, past his chest, through our bodies, and wrapped both arms around his waist, full body to body, fingers to spine, warmth against warmth, so close that I could hear him swallow. 2 ushers rushed over and separated me from my discovery of laud and lust. I don't know how long we stood like that, but one usher pushed my forehead off of Alex like there was glue between us. They rushed us into the vestibule. One usher had to be at least 127 years old, slapped my arm. The other pointed her chip nail polish back and forth between us and hissed about sin and slippery slopes. A hug is worship, I said, as Alex's face relaxed into a soft giggle. They were not amused. The ancient usher waved our mothers down from the front. Mama left her notepad on her chair to the side of the small podium where she was preparing to preach about the fruit of the Spirit. When Mama arrived, the ushers explained with great exaggeration what had happened. Now, listening to their replay of things, you would have thought I cannonballed off the pulpit, chased Alex down, and squeezed his holy ass. Now, I don't know how much of their story Mama believed, but I do know the horror painted on the face of Alex's mama and the disgust written on Mama's face. Mama dropped her shoulders and apologized to Alex's mom. Mama's eyes are simmering coals as she grabs my hand, twisting my arm, and hauls me out the side door, across the lot, into the car. Her daily warning, don't do nothing to embarrass me when we leave this house, replays in my head. My private defects had drifted into our public life, making it hard for Mama to swallow that her son might just be the worst kind of fruit, a rotten seed. I have to block out the drumming of her feet pounding into the floor. If I don't, I can't tell you how Alex catches me looking at him as much as I catch him looking at me every Sunday. That Alex is 3 years older than me, that his lips, soft and pink, bounce open at the end of every amen like a warm revelation, that he's been blessed with a light mustache, or that his dress shirt grips his chest as if he buttons them with his heart. I'm doing the best I can, Lord, Mama says, soft feet. Tears slide down her face. I'm not gonna beat you, she says. Sitting beside me, rubbing circles in my back, Mama's trembling voice shares the story of an uncle who was left out of our family mythology, a record of rewards and warnings passed between mouths, stories of runaway slaves, gun-wielding, moonshine-selling women, and survivors of the 1917 massacre, an uncle who ran from the church, a man who chose a life without the word, another sassy boy who made his mother's womb unworthy. This uncle, my uncle, was killed by a jealous lover years before I was born, and I have never seen Mama cry this hard and scary. Like she'll melt right in front of me. I bite into my bottom lip and take a deep breath to hold back the questions swimming in my head. Why didn't she tell me about him sooner? Is he the reason she is always so angry with me? Is she afraid that things I love will murder me? Has she already added me to our family's shame? I'm angry, most of all, at myself for bringing Mama to tears. Perhaps her telling me this is a sign. Perhaps this is God pointing my clouded thoughts and warning me that a flirting son can burn a life away. What kind of son would I be if I allowed the world inside of me to make Mama this dangerously sad? She's trembling. Is she scared of losing me like she lost her brother? I cry with her and apologize, burying my face into her lap. Mama lifts me and grabs me by the face. Jesus is gonna fix it, baby. Mama has 2 sets of tears. One boils from the inside, erupts in anger, and melts all the joy out of her. The other painting her face now along single streams that lightens the heart and lifts heavy burdens. I'm grateful for the relief in Mama's breath, but I ain't no less confused. This feels like a second chance, a new start, but at what? I don't know. I cry for myself, but I smile for her. I'll keep smiling. My lips will stretch and open. My life will stretch and open to prove to her that I can be a normal boy, a righteous son. I'll drop my shoulders and my shadows. I'll open my Bible and turn to every battered page that holds forgiveness. I'll hide behind durable scriptures, and if these steps don't work, I'll drown whatever is inside of me in the same water used to baptize. Perhaps there was a haunting left for me by an uncle who couldn't be caught by his Holy Ghost. Perhaps God does work in mysterious ways. Perhaps I am a mysterious way. Perhaps if I repent, I'll be pure and holy, tried and true, because God loves mama more than he hates me. Or maybe my sky is falling, and this is how a sun tears himself in half to keep the moon whole at the end of the night. Mama comes to my room with her easy after prayer smile. She walks over to my bed. I roll over, sit up against the headboard. She softly takes my hand and pulls me close. We are closer than we have ever been. Mama's heart is like music, a calm, steady rhythm. I bite down into my bottom lip to swallow the questions. Can we stay like this? Am I forgiven? Am I cured? But I can't stop myself from trying to remember if the space between Alex and I was this balmy, a word used to describe an irresistible thing that is both pleasantly warm and extremely foolish.
That was Tay Smith, everybody. Give it up. All right. Thank you again for being here. If we haven't already said that, thank you, Natalka and Tay, for reading. Our last reader for tonight is Olivia Clare Friedman. So I've been reading Olivia's book, Here Lies, the past 10 days. It was the only book that I brought with me on my trip to Iceland. If you didn't know, I just got back. I got back at 1 a.m. this morning. I could barely put this book down. I read it while the northern lights swirled behind me and on the edge of a hot spring, praying I didn't drop it in the water. Not because I was worried my Kindle would break, but because I was worried I wouldn't know what happened next in the book. As someone who has suffered a lot of personal loss early in life, this book that deals with the dilemmas facing the main characters of Here Lies, it really resonated with me, everything that they go through. And as a resident of New Orleans, the idea of a future Louisiana ravaged by climate change resonates as well. If this sounds like it resonates with you, come see me afterwards. I will be selling copies of Olivia's book in the back right over there. And also some collections, the short story collection. Yes. But you know what? Don't just take my word for it. Here's what some other writers have to say about Here Lies. Kai Harris wrote the following from the New York Times. Friedman's poetic novel explores mourning, memory, and the motherhood in a future Louisiana that's been ravaged by climate change. The reader becomes immersed in Friedman's layered and luscious prose, the vibrant colors of Alma's world. The flowers so real you can smell the rankness, the air brimming with sweet candied steak. Most captivating, though, is the stillness and quiet, lines that end abruptly, and the images that conjure a deafening silence. Representations of the graveyards that no longer exist, whose absence is haunting. And from M.O. Walsh, aka Big Daddy Neal, for those of us with CWW ties. Here Lies is a novel of both big ideas and intimate moments. At the same time speculative and familiar, the book sows patterns of longing and loss into a shape that anyone who has ever needed and found a non-traditional family will recognize and cherish. Like most great books to come out of the South, the relentless skill and grace of the author makes a simple story of Louisiana transcend far beyond its borders. Make no mistake, Olivia Clare Friedman is one of the most singular voices in American literature, and this book, like all of her work, belongs in your hands. And again, if that resonates with you, please see me afterwards.
Olivia Clare Friedman is the author of the novel Here Lies from Grove Atlantic and a book of short stories, Disasters in the First World, from Grove Press Black Hat. She is also the author of a book of poems, The 26-Hour Day. Her stories have been published in the Paris Review, Granta, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, the Southern Review, and elsewhere. Her poems have appeared in Poetry, the Southern Review, Denver Quarterly, and other journals. For her fiction, she is the recipient of an O. Henry Prize, a Pushcart Prize, and a Rowan Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. For her poetry, she is the recipient of a Ruth Lilly Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation and the Olive B. O'Connor Fellowship from Colgate University. She has been awarded fellowships from McDowell, Vermont Studio Center, the DeGerasi Resident Artist Program at Tin House. She is an assistant professor in English creative writing at the University of Southern Mississippi, where she holds the title of Nina Bell Suggs Endowed Professor. Olivia Clare Friedman.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here, and I also just want to give a special round of applause to Nikki and Michelle for this great amazing kind of inaugural reading. This is really incredible. It's funny because I've worked behind the scenes in reading series too, and it's one of those things where it can look like it's, you know, like you put on a show and then you know, everybody goes home, but it's a lot to do. And so I just thank you so much for all of your work on this reading and more readings to come. I'm gonna read, before I read a little from my novel, I'm gonna read from my book of poems, which came out in 2015, and like Nikki and Michelle were saying, I started in poetry before I ever started writing fiction. So my poetry self from years ago would be really, really, really shocked that I'd be like going around reading from my novel. And even when I started writing fiction, I didn't expect to write a novel. I was really in short stories because, you know, as you can see from this book, my poems tend to be kind of short lyrics. So when I got to the short story and I was writing like even 2,000 words, it's like, oh my God, which for fiction writers is not, you know. And so even writing like a 3,000 word short story was a really big deal. So I never thought I'd write a novel. And here we are. Now I'm working on a new one. But I'm going to read just one poem from this book, and I don't remember where it is. But it's an homage to Whitman's To a Locomotive in Winter, which I remember reading that poem in high school. We didn't have very much poetry in high school. And I grew up in Baton Rouge. We didn't have very much poetry in high school, and I always tell my students that because a lot of times when they come to me in, you know, creative writing class or a world literature class, they're concerned about poetry. You know, they're worried about poetry. And I said, we had just a little bit of poetry in high school, and now look, I'm a poet, you know, and I'm a fiction writer. So. But I remember this poem from high school, and it's Whitman, and he's praising this locomotive, this train. And so I wanted to write a poem that's kind of an homage to that poem, that's just this song of praise. But it makes more sense through the sound of it, through the sound of the language than anything else. So just kind of ride along with the sound with me. It's called Thee. Thee from my red breast. Thee and thy overture, thy muscled dual thrush, and thy blatantly clock, thy bleeding Saint Cyprian body, thy palpitating Siegfried, parallax and rococo, habeas corpus slang at thy sides, thy metropolis, now swine and robin pantheon, now tar in the resistance, thy loom, blockade, bound variable star, tilled with perpendicular, thy dualist and turpentine, Belgravia from thy smut, thy knitted franchise, spurge and vandal, trench mouth of thy whippoorwill, thy caraway, Oberon and Mobius fluorescing through storm of Calpurnia, now spackle, now shank of soldier catalepsing, trick of the modulation emblem of motley and PR prick of the continent, come sewage the muse and merge in a toxin with stratosphere and falling soapstone. By AM, thy Warwick ringworm bell to cue Susa. By PM, thy silica signals Lancelot to swing. Roman through my chaos, with all thy anarchy of muskox, thy smarmy lamps at nihil, thy prehistoric laughter, thy ecliptic, rumbling like an Easter, lax on thyself, replete, thine own trackfish hawk haranguing, no sequestered WC of talcum harness or global platitude vine, thy trinity of screech, by rapier and telegram returned, laurel o'er the preempt wide, albeit the lamb, to the free slander, unpent and glider and sticks. The other poems in that book make more sense in the way that we think of sense. That's the only poem that does that. But I loved writing it. I want to write more like that, actually. Okay, I'm going to read a little from my novel. And Neil, I think maybe you've heard me read these same excerpts a couple times. And so the premise of this novel is that it takes place in an alternate future. We're in 2042 in a fictional town in Louisiana. And like I said, I grew up in Louisiana, not in an alternate future, but I grew up in Baton Rouge, and this isn't Baton Rouge. This is a smaller town. And so because of the effects of climate change, cremation has now been mandated by the government. And not only that, but ashes have now are being confiscated by the government. So the story, that's the premise, and the story follows Alma, who's a young woman whose mother has passed away, who's been cremated, and Alma is trying to get her mother's ashes back. And she's looking for some loopholes to do that at the beginning of the novel, but that is where we find her, is trying to get her mother's ashes back. And so this starts out in a public library. I love writing about public libraries. I have stories set in, I always kind of return to public libraries. And so this starts in a public library, and Alma meets a character named Gordelon. And Gordelon has also gone through some big grief in her life. And but when they meet, they're not so sure about each other. From before I began, I loved her. This was what I knew. Before the beginning, before I was born from her, before bones and blood and body, before egg. My mother, Naomi, was dead. Dead, in fact, for half a year. Her body burned to ashes by the state. Bones, heart, feet, eyes burned to dust against her wish, against mine, and that was that. I was trying to understand. I was at the library for the first time since she died. Upstairs on the second floor, the air was muggy and dim. I zoomed between empty carrels toward the faraway corner, a place I used to call my own, a row of 3 computers. Here, I could be alone. No one, not for years, seemed to know the spot. To my right were shelves of hardbacks, amber and green, the color of jewels. To my left, out the smudged picture window, I could watch the sun-sopped fields of weeds and goldenrod shake in the wind, feel my own insides shake in an answer. I walked to the spot, heard my own breathing. I reached the corner and stopped. In front of me, a girl sat at one of the keyboards where she heard me and glanced up, a burst of hazel gold eyes. silky blue eyeshadow. She said nothing, went back to her screen. I said nothing too. How long had she been coming? I wanted to make her get up, shove her chair, force her to leave. That was what the mean-hearted me would do, or the bold-hearted me. And sometimes I allowed my dolty-dolt heart these fantasies. All I wanted was peace. I wanted to do what I needed to do, alone. I told her to go away in my head. Get gone, get gone. I sat down on the other end, left a computer station between us, logged myself in. The girl clicked and typed and clicked. Her fingernails were painted a clean, frosty blue. She breathed through her mouth, loud puffs of air. She put a foot up on the chair, adjusted a pink sparkling flip-flop, the kind you see in the drugstore aisle with Water Baby sunscreen and inflatable beach balls. She scratched her naked toes. They have computers downstairs, I told her. Downstairs they go faster. She looked at her screen. These are dinosaurs, I said. You can't even watch a movie. I hit the back of the monitor hard as though it weren't working, as though that would show her how feeble it was, but it was working just fine. I know that already, she said. I glimpsed her screen. She was speed scrolling through pictures and paragraphs of gossip about TV stars and blog celebrities and Hollywood he said, she said heartbreaks. She looked younger than me, but near enough to my age, give or take, and I was 22. I said, downstairs the AC won't blow on you. I'm not cold, she said. I said, downstairs the librarian sneaks you free Cokes. I'm not thirsty, she said. I'm going to skip a little to later in the chapter now. And they've talked more, and as you might imagine, they're getting along a little better. And like I said, Alma realizes that Bordelon has gone through some major grief on her own. She was taller than me, not difficult, with me are hardly over 5 feet, with very ordinary blue eyes, very ordinary brown hair, very ordinary small teeth. There was nothing humdrum, ho-hum about her. She was one of the most beautiful people I had ever seen. I didn't know why I said this then, but I did. What was your grandmother's name? I thought she'd tell me to leave the subject alone, yet without even taking a breath, she said, Beatrice. Beatrice, the name of someone no longer with us. I liked thinking of my own mother's name, Naomi. For now, I could only hold the word in my head, never speak it aloud. Naomi. It was like the syllables of a spell. The name had shock and thrum. Beatrice, I said. I leaned on my car and Bordelon looked down. Just like that, 2 tears fell from her eyes to the ground. I thought of the girl in the fairy tale whose tears turned to seeds, to sprouts, to flowers. We said nothing for a minute, just stood. Silence was as near to us as a third person. Something I'd started to know was this. Grief was a string that held people together. I don't really need to be alone up there, I said. It's not like I own the 2nd floor. I get it, she said. She was still looking down, letting her eyes search the ground. I'm always alone, I said. Maybe too much. I like the company. I half meant it. She looked at me finally, her lids and lashes damp. I had no tissue. I won't watch what you're doing, she said. I never do. Turn up your music, I don't care. She sniffled and smiled, rubbed snot from her nose with the back of her fingernails, with the back of her hand, chipped blue fingernails. I heard thunder. I raised my eyes to the lightning crazing the clouds. I was ready for rain to follow, but this time it didn't come. It was August. Any mild or mean weather could and would arrive. I took out my phone, put on music, something sulky and punk from the 90s. I had a 6-pack litter of Abitas in my back seat. We sat on the trunk of my car and started in on those. It would be light for hours. I looked at her face. I every chance I could. Her smooth forehead, her eyes gone to clear gold in the light, her hair long and dark and frayed. I gave in. We both had another beer and another as the night cooled and flickered and zoomed. So I'm going to read a little bit more from later in the book. I would say if this book had a drink, the drink for this book is Abita Purple Haze. There's a lot of Abita in this book. Any Abita fans out there? Yeah, it's like, yeah. So I'm going to read a little more from later in the book, and this will be the last section that I read. And the book is a lot about grief, but it's also very much about hope and what comes on the other side of grief. And it's also thinking a lot about mourning and public rituals of mourning and how we mourn our dead, and also our choice in being able to do that. And I wrote a good portion of this book during heavy COVID era. I know we're still in COVID, but I wrote a good portion of this book when we were all in lockdown. And so I was, people often ask me if I was thinking about that a lot and what so many of us were going through with mourning and grief during that time. And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. So COVID is not in this book, the pandemic is not in this book, but it was very influenced. This book is very influenced by my own emotional experiences and of many others as well for this book. So this last section I'm going to read, it's later on, and Alma has kind of gathered more friends to kind of help her get her mother's ashes back and also kind of get on the other side of her grief. And so this is a scene between Alma and Josephine, and they're in the garden, and the theme of nature and what we can do when we turn to the natural world is a big theme in this book. We began with the weeds, rank and wild. They were knotted in great clumps all around the seedlings and sprouts. I let the weeds grow, said Josephine. She pulled on her gloves, tugged the brim of her Tabasco cap low on her head, and knelt down. We'll get them, but leave some in there. I always leave some in. I didn't ask why. I knew at least one reason. They were weeds, but delicate. Weeds, but pretty and spangled with color, star-shaped, tiny blooms lulled on their stems. What was the difference between weed and flower? These weeds tangled and rolled like shapes of green brains and briar. She reached out, gripped a long stem by its neck. She yanked, tearing the weed straight from the soil. If the weed could have screamed, I believe it would have. She moved onto the head of a snarled weed clump, ripped the bunch from the ground with a single snap. I could hear them break from the earth. Come on, she said. Help me. She didn't look up. She moved to the next batch, steadying herself on her knees, ready to rip the sleek stems. Come, she said. I knelt beside her, chose a weed bunch, wrapped my hand there as if to strangle, and I strangled. I pulled up, I tore, their roots like a thick nest, their leaves warm and bristled. We discarded to the right, moved to the left, pulled and grabbed and snatched and seized. I pretended my hand was a mouth, and down the mouth came, open and ready, biting each weed from the ground. To pray, said Josephine, is to hope, to ask and wonder. What do you want to ask? She didn't look up. She tore at a tough stem violently. You don't have to say it out loud. You can ask without using words. I said nothing. It was as though I were asking something of the world without exactly knowing the words or what it was. A tendril of moss wormed its gray way around a flowering weed. At the center of the petals, the heart of the flower sat like a gold eye. I almost left it there. But the garden sprouts were overrun, would need to grow. I snapped the head of the flower clean from the stem. Josephine stopped, looked to me. Good. she said. Very good. Keep going now. Keep asking. I sat up on my knees, pulled back my hair. I scratched my nose with the heel of my hand. The pinwheel was right there, turning in the hot wind. I bent back down to work beside her. I was asking, weeding, ripping, feeling my asking becoming a new thing, becoming anger. I moved farther, I moved faster, my hands clearing, attacking. Sprouts from the seeds we planted were more and more visible, like stars, opening, brightening. I clawed and shredded, bursting, splitting the stems, and then, without thinking, I bent down to the ground, opened my mouth, bit the pink flowering head of a weed from its stem with my teeth. I tasted earth. I tongued and teethed the texture of petal and bloom and soft lips. Josephine turned, watched me as I chewed the flower, and she opened her mouth wide and laughed, the scar above her lip trembling, a full-hearted laugh, the best I'd ever heard. I swallowed the flower. I buried it in my body. Come with me, she said. She stood with difficulty, her knees crackling. She went to a little table she kept in the yard and picked up 2 garden spades. She handed one to me, bronzed with rust, the shape of a tongue. She led me to the edge of the yard, to a tree stump striped with beads of fungus. She held her spade up over her head, and in a blur, she brought the spade down on the stump with a solid clang. Holy shit, I said. It's good for you, she said, wiping sweat from the back of her neck. Releases energy. She brought her spade up again and hit the tree stump square on the bulbs of fungus. Go to it, she told me. You hit as much as you want. You could break the shovel, I said. Nevertheless, she said. She brought up her spade, hit the stump with an even stronger blow. I do it all the time, she said. She gave another hit, letting out a tremendous breath. All the time, she said. Go to it. I raised my spade in the air, opened my eyes wide, gave a short yell. I brought the spade down, clanging it on the stump, the sound of the hit soaring, loud and clean. I was home before dusk. The skies stung with deep pink. In my mother's room, at the sagging center of the bed, I sat with my dull graphite pencil, my drawing pad laid on my crossed knees. Here was the crest of her forehead, her eyes flecked with light, the bare tree of veins at her temple. I kept a rhythm, my pencil barely lifting, a song to the sound of the lead across paper, the jaw that softly V'd to her chin. I was drawing my mother's face from memory. My best photo of her was still in my leather portfolio. To myself, I called the photo the pearl-eyed picture. Her face was only half in frame, cut off at the edge. There was the fanned wave of her hair, a delicate ear, and one blue pearled eye. I took it out only rarely. I could never look at it long. You could not simply sit and stare at a book of spells. Thank you.
Give it up one more time, not just for Olivia, but all 3 of our readers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having our first reading be a smashing success. I am Nikki, this is Michelle. Please follow Liminal Lit on Instagram and on Facebook. Check out our page where we have a website forthcoming. We have a few upcoming events. Like I mentioned earlier, next Sunday, 2 to 4 at St. Roch Market, Kirsten Renaud, who has like a million different books coming out, like a fiction chapbook and a creative nonfiction chapbook and a poetry. She's crushing every genre. She will be teaching a Flash CNF workshop. It's completely free to the community. So please come out September 25th, that's next Sunday. And if you can't make it, October 16th, she's doing it all again on Zoom. Check out our social media for more info.
Where's our workshop next week?
October 9th, oh, next week, Same Rock Market.
Same.
Rock Market. October 9th, we have a generative poetry workshop at the Bulldog in Mid-City.
Nice.
3 to 5 p.m. And then October 23rd is our next reading. We have Anel Lopez who's here. Where are you at, Anel? Yes, excellent, at the bar. So that's going to be amazing. We have Isaac Loritzen who's coming all the way from Chicago to visit us. And then Georgia Pearl Foster, who's coming from rural Idaho to celebrate the release of her first poetry collection. She's kicking off her tour here in New Orleans
Let's
at
go.
lmnl. So please come on out. That is October 23rd. And we have plenty of other local superstars and national superstars coming to visit in November and December. So please stay in touch with us. We'd love to see you again. Anything else, Michelle? All the love. We love you very much. Thank you for being here. Oh, and come by Here Lies or a collected short stories. Come see me. And I'm sure Olivia would love to sign it for you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Here.